With that, I will call the November 20th Airport Commission meeting to order and ask for a roll call.
Commissioner Khan. Chair Craig.
Here.
Curry. Commissioner Hopkins.
Here.
Commissioner Wilson.
Here.
Commissioner Bowen.
Here.
Commissioner Houghton.
Here.
Commissioner Goodman. And we have a quorum.
All right, thanks, Mo. Do we have any changes to the agenda?
No changes to the agenda.
Okay, it notices that on Thursday, November 14th, 2019 at 5 p.m., the Airport Commission Secretary, Maureen, who actually is the one who runs the airport, duly posted this agenda on the bulletin board at the airport administration. So now we'll move on to public comment on items that are not on the agenda. And as those of you who have just come in, if you have speaker slips, if you wish to speak, please make sure those get filled out and get given to Mo in the red sweater down there. I have two speaker slips on items on the agenda. The first is, I believe, from Vince VM. Is that you, Vince?
Yes.
And that's on airport improvement process.
In order to be efficient, I've written it down so I can go through it quickly here.
Thank you, Vince.
What I'd like to say is that when proposing significant changes to the operation of the Santa Barbara Airport, the airport administration has a legal obligation to inform the public with timely notification of the pending considerations and changes. Notification must be, as a minimum, include the following. It must include all potential affected parties should be notified. The notification of affected users must be afforded the right to comment on pending changes. They must be notified with the appropriate amount of time to consider and respond to what is being proposed. If the affected users are to provide meaningful comments on the proposed regulations, they must not only be so informed in a timely manner, they must also be told the details of what specific changes are being proposed. They should not be left with a shadow box of many alternatives, with the final proposal not appearing until days before a hearing. And finally, they must have the procedures must allow for a full and complete airing of their concerns. And I would hope that the Airport Commission will operate this way. And the reason I'm up here talking now is the proposal that's before the commissioners today didn't meet any of the requirements. It perhaps did in skeleton, but in fact it didn't come close to doing any of these. There's lots of users who have not been identified who are going to be grossly affected, and so forth. So I respectively hope that in the future, this type of thing will be, these things will be included in future proposals. So if I have one more minute, I'd like to ask Mr. Hopkins a question. It's been reported in the newspaper that your intention is to proceed to the city council regardless of what these folks say. Is that a misstatement on the part of the newspaper, or is that in fact?
Vince, I'd point
Thompson,
out.
I'm sorry.
Vince, I'd point out as a matter of order, the public comment section is for you to make comments. It's not an interactive conversation. It wouldn't be appropriate to address a question and expect an answer.
If
but
Mr. Thompson would like to respond, can he do so?
You are at 2 minutes and 55 seconds, so it just wouldn't be appropriate for a back and forth dialogue.
I'm not planning back and forth, just giving the man an opportunity to speak.
And this isn't the forum for that. Thanks, Vince. Okay, next and last, we have Nancy Gardner regarding residential flyovers.
Hello, Commissioners. My name is Nancy Gardner, and I live in the Rancho Embarcadero neighborhood of Goleta. We're a rural group of homes across the freeway directly from the Bacara Ritz-Carlton Hotel. So I built my home in 1992, and because my office is in my home, I've pretty much been aware of what the norms are of what it feels like during the day there. In the past few years, there's been an increasing frequency of small plane flyovers, low and loud, directly over my home. Low and loud enough that clients on the phone are saying, like, what is that noise? Did you guys move? Is that an airplane I can hear in the background? And this is like when I'm in the house. It's been perplexing to me because I'm surrounded by thousands of empty acres. Yet planes continue to fly low right over my house and those of my neighbors many times per day, despite the directive to, quote, avoid residential overflights whenever possible, unquote. In just one example, on May 2nd, planes flew low directly over my home at 10:57, 10:50, 10:58 again, 11, and 11:02. So that's 5 planes within 5 minutes. So that's a legit example. On the SBA website, 2 of the SBA's stated goals are achieve airport operations compatible with the surrounding communities and maintain a continuing dialogue between the airport and the surrounding community. So pursuant to these stated goals, I spent the last 4 to 5 months researching the situation, documenting flights, studying the SBA website and what pilot instructions do exist, as well as interviewing people who are part of the aviation committee. And as I looked at the issues in depth, one of the things I found was a noise abatement procedure map that has not been updated since 2005 and doesn't even include my neighborhood. It ends at the west end of the El Encanto neighborhoods. So why isn't my neighborhood of 177 homes included on that? That would make sense to me. This is just one example of many of the problematic areas that I found as I researched. I've heard the phrase, the airport has no power over what happens in the air. But there's a substantial influence that the airport could have over a large community of pilots, flight schools, and flight clubs that I do not see as currently being utilized effectively. The airport certainly has significant influence, and within that influence is power to truly be that good neighbor, which is a stated goal all over the website. I documented and summarized my findings in a letter sent October 5th to Erin Keller, the operations director, with additional CCs to all of the staff members. And though I've not yet received a response, I know things are really busy, I'd like to share a copy of the letter with the commission as well. It's a long letter, but because the noise abatement plan and good neighbor policy don't feel like they're working for me, I feel like it's important to document exactly what's going on. So I respectfully ask that each of you would read that letter at your convenience. And thank you for your service on the commission and a chance to share some of my thoughts and concerns.
Thanks, Nancy. Okay, that is the end of the 2 public comment requests on items that are not on the agenda. So moving on to liaison reports. Do we have Jason Dominguez in the audience? We do not. And how about our Goleta liaison member? We do not. I guess there's no liaison that's going to happen tonight. So will that move on to the director's report?
Good evening, Commissioners. We're sad to report that Tom Bullers, the airport financial analyst, has resigned his position and accepted a position with the city of Camarillo. While this is a loss to the airport, we're happy for Tom and his new opportunity. This new position takes him closer to home and eliminates the commute, so it's a huge benefit for him. We will have support from city staff, and we'll continue to manage Tom's responsibility until a suitable replacement is found. We are in the process of recruiting for that position as we speak. United Airlines has announced they will be launching nonstop service to Chicago O'Hare on June the 4th, 2020. This well-sought-after service is an excellent addition to the airport's flight options and will depart at 11 p.m. daily and arriving in Chicago on time to conduct morning business or to connect easily and quickly to East Coast flights or international destinations as well. So we're very excited for United's partnership in launching this new service. Passengers using the airport continue to grow in record numbers. This holiday season will prove to be very busy given the many flight options and additional seats that we have in our market. So we're very thankful for that. Facilities will be busy and at capacity during peak times. Ultimately, we should end the year with very strong passenger numbers, likely a record year for the airport. And we'll share more with you on that at a later date. And with that, do we have any staff reports? Business?
Alrighty, good evening, Commissioners. Just a couple of items from the business side as well as marketing.
Deanna, I
Yes.
apologize, going to interrupt you just for a minute.
Yes.
Henry, I just had a question. Are we opening the overflow parking?
Yes, it's pretty much open year round at this point. Yeah.
So it's not really overflow anymore, it's just
No,
parking. Okay, thanks. Sorry.
No, that's all right. Actually, I was just about to touch on that. We are going to be very busy between the 24th and the 27th of this month will be our busiest days. We anticipate on the 26th, that'll be our busiest day with likely in excess of 3,000 passengers that day. So we're really monitoring that. We have some prognoses on an hour-by-hour basis, so we're managing the parking lot capacity as carefully as we can. We will have an additional shuttle, so we'll have 3 shuttle vans operating from the off-site lot. We're also anticipating having a variable message sign out on Fairview if the lot fills, so we can direct people back to the lot before they've had a chance to the terminal, save a little bit of time that way. We'll issue a press release about this all tomorrow and hopefully get some good media exposure about that. Also, happy to say that our website is finally launching. It'll be launching at 9 a.m. tomorrow morning, our brand new website. We're not going to do a media release about that specifically tomorrow. We're going to kick the tires for a week or so, make sure that everything is working the way it's supposed to, and then we will get out and publicize that. Otherwise, a couple other notes. The deployment of our common use gate system is now complete, so all of the gates in the terminal are on common use equipment, and we're working through our first 30 days of pain trying to help everyone learn how to use the system and load the paper properly and all that. So, and then just one last thing on the staffing front. At the end of next month, we will be losing another tenured employee here. Lynn Houston in my marketing group has announced her retirement, so she will be leaving us at the end of December and be looking to replace her in 2020. So, thank you.
A year or two ago, 3 maybe, when we were running the shuttles back and forth, as I recall, it was something on the order of $800,000 a year for what I thought at that time was one shuttle. What are these 3 continuous shuttles costing us?
Well, this is an instance where Tom would be very helpful to have right here. But I can tell you that the cost for parking in general under our new operator have gone down considerably. While it is expensive to run a shuttle, I actually believe that it is comparatively cheaper than what it was before. So we've saved quite a bit of money by transitioning to a different parking operator. But inevitably, we think we're going to have to upgrade our shuttles. They're going to need to be larger, hopefully getting some environmentally friendly shuttles to boot, and that most likely will drive up costs. So we're going to be looking very carefully at the rate structure for parking, both at the terminal and in the off-site lot, so we can look towards at least trying to achieve some sort of cost recovery on that. So there'll be more to come about that.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks, folks. Any commission members, any questions on the director's report? Okay, we'll move on to the consent calendar. 2 items on that. One, the minutes. The recommendation is the Airport Commission waive the reading and approve the minutes of the commission meeting that was held Friday, October 11th, 2009. And also that the airport waive the reading and approve the minutes of the commission meeting that was held Wednesday, October 16th, 2019. Is that accurate?
That's correct.
Okay.
The October the 11th is the retreat that we had.
Oh, okay,
Yes,
thank you.
that was a meeting.
So can I get a motion on the commission to,
move so.
and a second? All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed?
I abstain. I have a family involvement in one of the leases.
Commissioner Wilson, I think, I was just looking at the agenda, I think you're on the administrative report, so I think you can vote on this one. It will be,
I'm sorry.
number
You're-
7.
You're in fact correct.
So that's a yes vote,
Yes,
just for the record?
Aye.
Okay. So that's carried unanimously. And then second, the property management report, recommendation the airport commission receive the monthly airport property management report.
Greg, before we launch into that, I might just mention
I
it.
noticed him, I'm going to get to him right after we get through this.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So move.
Were you going to say something, Tava?
Are we still on the consent calendar?
Yes.
Yes.
I need to clarify the motion because there may be a member that needs to abstain.
Okay. On the property management report?
Okay, we're good, thank you.
Okay. Okay, so I think I heard a motion.
Move to receive the monthly property management report.
And a second?
Second?
All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Alrighty. So we're gonna go out of order here. I see that Jason has arrived to an almost standing room only crowd. So if you could enlighten us with the Santa Barbara news, we would sure appreciate it.
Yes, and thank you for allowing me to go a little bit late. I was at an earlier meeting, and I had tried to contact one of your members earlier to get some more information and found out she was out of the country, and I talked to Carl before I came earlier, so I don't have very much to say from the council's point of view per usual. I'm more here to hear if you guys have anything you want me to bring back to council. I know there's a lot of people here today, so I'm definitely taking back the news of, I think, what is in most people's interest today back to council. But if there's anything else that you'd like me to bring back to council, I'm happy to take that back.
Okay.
Any questions on things you've seen council dealing with that you have questions about? Otherwise, I'll let you move on with the agenda.
Doesn't sound like it.
Okay.
Thank you, Jason.
Thank you much. Thank you.
Okay, on to administrative reports. And looks like we have an administrative report on a lease agreement with Skate One Corporation.
Alrighty, good evening, commissioners.
Hold on. Commissioner Wilson, is this the item that you...
Yes, it is.
Okay, could you state your conflict, and then I'll ask you to recuse yourself and step out of the room, and Mo will come get you as soon as we're done.
My grandson's daughter is an employee of Skate One working in their Singapore office.
Thank you, Commissioner Wilson. If you could just step out of the room for this item, and we'll come get you as soon as we're done.
Feels like he's been banished. Especially walking out in complete silence. Okay, it looks like Elvis has left the building there, so can we move on to the administrative report on the lease agreement with Skate One Corporation?
Excellent. Again, good evening, commissioners. We have actually one lease action this evening, and it has to do with the 6100 Hollister project. And we bump to the next slide. Yes, just Skate One. Obviously, you guys have heard of this company, at least some of you have. Next slide, we'll just look at the location. This is Building 5, so this lease is proposed for the entire Building 5, both sections of it. There are two parts of it. So this company would be leasing this property for a long-term lease. On the next slide, we'll see that it is proposed as a 10-year lease and actually 2 5-year options. We'll go to the next slide. There you go. So this is a company that has been in the community for a very long time. They are one of the world's most premier skateboard designers and manufacturers. They currently have all of their activity here in the Goleta area, but they will be relocating their manufacturing and warehousing activities to Ventura. But they wish to have their R&D and their design remain in Santa Barbara. So that's what the use of the space is for. So they are committing to a long-term tenancy, 10 years with 2 5-year options, as I said. And the proposed cost per square foot is $1.60, which I'm sure you know is well within that what we expected to receive for that property. We'll have an annual CPI increase, common area maintenance charges, electrical utilities, and all that good stuff. So this is a great tenant, and we're hoping that you will concur and approve the lease. It will need to go to the City Council for final approval because of the length of the lease. So, thank you.
All right, thanks, Deanna. Any questions on the commission?
Just compliments for landing such a high-quality tenant for such a long time. Good job, staff.
And he's a pilot.
Yeah, he has that black turboprop hat. Okay.
But he's a pilot and an airplane owner based here on in this airport.
And Deanna, where does that leave us occupancy-wise on that strip?
So at this point, we only have 2 locations that are still available, one of which actually has a pretty close to fruition prospect, and that is Unit 4B. So once that is leased, the only remaining space will be the retail space on the back side of the coffee shop. So that will be the only remaining space.
Okay. Thank you very much. So before we move on to item 8.
Do we need to make a motion?
Actually, I don't, do we need to approve this?
Yes.
We do, oh, okay, I'm sorry. My apologies.
I move that we approve the lease.
Second?
All in favor?
Aye.
Any
Aye.
opposed? All right, that's carried. Thank you very much. Can somebody invite our banished
Member back in.
airport member back in?
Welcome back, Jim.
What kind of minivan? Oh, a Scion. A Scion minivan. I feel like I'm announcing. A Scion minivan's in a parking lot with the lights on. If anybody has a Scion minivan, one of those little QB-looking things, the lights are on. Thanks, Mo. So before we move on to item 8, which is, I think, why most of the folks in the audience are here tonight, I wanted to just remind everybody of a couple of things. First, I know this is a charged topic. Many of you who are here tonight were around and present when we had the stakeholder meetings a few years ago. I was the chairman of that. It, by and large, went relatively smoothly, but because there were some heated emotions, it got what I think a few times was pretty personal and a little bit out of control. And so what I would ask everybody in the audience, I know this is a charged issue, and what I would ask everybody, when it comes time to your 3 minutes, please, looks like I have about 35 or 40 minutes of speaker slips. Please keep the 3 minutes. I will give everybody a chance to speak. I would hope that we could do that with decorum and stating our opinions or case or whatever it is you'd like to say, but do that with respect and decorum. If, as chairman, I feel like that's getting out of control, I have several options before me. One is I can call a recess, which is what I would likely do. And that's where we just take a break, the commission will leave the meeting, and we'll just let everybody cool down a little bit. Failing that, if that doesn't solve or get things back on track, I have the option of calling another recess. and failing that, I can adjourn the meeting. So I would ask everybody to please keep all of that in mind, and I'm sure you will. And with that, I'll ask, we have item number 8 is subject, a report on independent commercial activity on the airport. Mo, can you get me another water?
Chairman Arcuri and Commissioners, before we begin our presentation, I'd like to make some comments about what we'll be sharing with you tonight. Agenda item number 8 before you today is complex, but brings necessary changes to the way business is being conducted on the airport today. Staff will walk you through this very complex issue, and we will provide the best solution to ensure this issue is addressed appropriately. There are those who are very passionate about the status quo and see no need to address the problems, or dead set on pointing the finger at a single problem on the airport. This option is not only untrue, but short-sighted, to say the least. Complaints can and will be filed, and it is up to the airport and the FAA to validate whether or not there is merit. In this case, there was sufficient merit to prompt the need for today's action. The issue we are attempting to address exists because the system needs to be fixed. The November 20th, 2018 letter from the FAA is in response to a single complaint and allegation, but highlights the problems we're having and places us on notice that we must address the issue. Specifically, the airport does not have control of significant activity occurring on airport property. That is, commercial business activity. For too long, this activity has gone uncontrolled, unchecked, which does not benefit the airport, and in fact greatly exposes the airport. The lack of control of this activity has created an environment that is ripe for misuse of the airport and exposes the airport financially and from a safety and security perspective, and from a liability perspective, and from a compliance perspective. The airport, both the staff and the commission, are obligated to address this issue and to look out for the best interest of the city and the airport. This is our primary objective. In doing so, we must be fair, we must be reasonable, and we must provide equal opportunity and treatment for all users. Our current policy does not meet this objective. Staff has been working hard to bring before you the right professional recommendation based upon established objectives and sound due diligence. Any suggestion that your staff is making a rash or quick decision is quite simply false, and anyone who might suggest this is just misinformed or conveniently forgets that this discussion has been going on for nearly 3 years. For many, the status quo is fine. However, in reality, this is not an acceptable solution. We have solicited comments on this matter and provided ample time for input on the recommendation before you today. Written input received has been carefully considered and, where appropriate, incorporated into today's recommendation or future rules. Today's meeting has also afforded anyone, or will offer anyone who desires to do so, to come before you in public comment and express their opinion as well. Agenda item number 8 does not ban or limit commercial activity on the airport in the sense that it's being described. What it does do is modifies how that activity is conducted on the airport to ensure everyone is held to the same standard. It ensures the airport is able to manage and enforce this activity. Anyone who desires to continue to operate from the airport may do so, provided they comply with the rules. While I have clearly heard comments related to delaying action on this item today, I've yet to hear what will be gained from this delay. What are we expected to gain or accomplish in the next days that we haven't done in the past 3 years? If everyone is focused on doing the right thing, then this need not be a contentious issue. Finally, agenda item number 8 before you essentially makes the airport's intent and commitment to address this matter clear, which will move this issue forward. The next steps would be the development of details of the minimum standard changes to implement the policy. There will be further discussion and outreach during this process prior to bringing it back to this body for final review before seeking City Council approval. Staff will make every effort to address many of the concerns raised from those affected, provided those are constructive comments, they're fair, reasonable, and allow for equal treatment. Any comments considered must also be an improvement in control, management, and enforcement while ensuring all airport and FAA requirements are met. I'm confident that the staff report we're about to present will speak for itself, and I urge each of you to make the very tough but right decision and vote in favor of this item. And with that said, we'll begin our presentation.
Good evening, Commissioners. As Henry alluded to, I'll be presenting the discussion of interest tonight and the proposed path to move forward with compliance so as not to jeopardize the grant funding that the airport currently receives through the Airport Improvement Program, which offers the airport currently today in excess of $3 million in critical infrastructure that is necessary for the operation of this facility. With that being said, moving directly into the focus of this presentation, it speaks to that we're seeking to identify a recommended policy to ensure the fair and equal treatment for all of those individuals involved in flight instruction activity. Additionally, we're looking to identify a policy that levels the playing field amongst those involved in all other commercial service activity outside of flight instruction at the airport that ensures fair and equal treatment to all of those with reasonable fees, insurance, appropriate indemnity, hold harmless, business licenses, which is required by the city, and all other equal requirements for those on the airfield. So, to first define what is an independent operator. An independent commercial operator is an entity or individual that provides commercial aeronautical services but does not operate out of an airport-owned or leased property. So speaking a little bit about the airport business, we are a business enterprise of the City of Santa Barbara. We receive no local tax dollars, as all funds we generate are used to support our operation here locally, and as such, all of those funds are required to remain on airport and are not accessible to the general fund of the City of Santa Barbara. So operating revenues are generated by our airport users, tenants, and those individuals that do conduct approved commercial activity on the airport. And all airport operations conducted must contribute to our financial health and the ability to provide, maintain, and upgrade these facilities, such as our runways and our taxiways. Additionally, the FAA requires that airports be financially self-sustaining and charge market rates for all facilities and services. Speaking about our city business license, City Municipal Code, Section 1808030, also requires that it must be permitted through City Hall. Operating on an airport is not a right, rather it's a privilege that comes with certain obligations that each entity must hold to. Failure to operate in a fiscally responsible manner may result in the inability for us to remain financially self-sustaining and could in theory become a taxpayer burden, as we clearly would like to continue operating this airport and we would have to seek assistance from City Hall. So a little background on the history for those that may not have been around, myself as well. Much research went into this. Back in 2016, the FAA updated FAA Order 5190.6B as a result of a published final policy in the Federal Register dated April 4th, 2016 that relates to flying clubs and airport minimum standards. This policy changed in a manner that allowed flying clubs to perform flight instruction for compensation at airports, member-to-member flight instruction. In response, staff at the time initiated an effort to modify the minimum standards, and this was done through the Airport Commission's General Aviation Subcommittee that negotiated a proposal with select stakeholders. The subcommittee recommended approval of the revisions to the minimum standards to the full commission back in the previous meeting that occurred on November 20th, 2017. And as such, the minimum standards have to be approved by City Council following airport, and that occurred on November 29th, 2017, which the City Council adopted on December 12th, 2017. So dating back to the notification that the airport received from the Western Regional Office, we received a letter from an individual who is the compliance manager for the region that notified us of a verbal complaint challenging the updated minimum standards policy regarding independent flight instruction. The FAA notified that the airport is potentially in violation of Grant Assurance number 22, which relates to economic non-discrimination or unlevel playing fields for different operators on the airfield. And in that letter, the FAA strongly recommended that the airport review and revise its rules and standards to establish and maintain an equitable, competitive environment for all operators on the airfield. So specifically, they're concerned that the $200 annual fee economically favors independent flight instructors and may be discriminatory to local flight schools. Despite a very liberal policy of the $200 annual fee, only a very small number of applications were submitted to the airport for review. And an even smaller number of fees by those independent flight instructors were collected. The FAA is concerned, kind of, when we approached them initially with this, they were concerned that we may be going down a path where we are implementing a permit program that we may not be able to manage. We may not be able to have appropriate oversight and enforcement of. So, policy objectives, what are we trying to do? Well, as I alluded to, the Airport Improvement Program funds that we receive are vital to the operation of this facility. So we're looking to comply with those grant assurances to ensure that all tenants are treated fairly and equally. We're also additionally looking to ensure that all commercial service providers that generate revenue on the airport are complying with those similar requirements that we spoke of earlier. Revenue generation for the facility, insurance, business license, hold harmless. So we've been working very closely with the FAA staff in order to develop a workable and compliant solution for Santa Barbara. FAA guidance, as we've been in this discussion, included a caution that we must be fair and reasonable to all entities on the airport and everyone must be treated equally. That's our intent. They also advised that any new policy affecting commercial activity, again, must be applied equally. So right now, current independent commercial activities that are occurring out on the airfield include flight instruction, aircraft maintenance, ground support equipment maintenance, aircraft detailing, washing, things of that nature. And they pay very or no fees and may or may not be under a lease agreement with the airport or a subtenant of an existing tenant on the airfield. Independent activity that competes with brick and mortar businesses may be receiving an economic advantage due to the lack of associated overhead costs. If you don't maintain a facility, therefore, it's hard to have an equal playing ground. So current independent operators, they do compete with our tenants who pay rent to the airport, generate little or no direct revenue to the airport. Additionally, we don't know the current insurance status, which is a liability to the airport, and they do not necessarily possess a city business license. With that, it potentially exposes the airport due to that liability and lack of a hold harmless. So, in essence, the operations that are occurring today may be presenting serious financial implications should an accident, incident, or something of that nature occur. Additionally, the current independent operation stymies competition from existing vetted commercial operators that do comply with those business requirements. It also, when you have this larger group of independents, it discourages new commercial operations from locating to the facility, because if the services are being provided, we then don't have the demand for potentially a new flight school or a new aircraft maintenance facility being based on the airport if it's done by through-the-fence operators. So, in essence, that results in a financial loss to the airport because that potential lease revenue may not be realized. So the challenge before us, again, going back to the objective of being fair and reasonable in all policies, and any policy that we implement that cannot be reasonably managed and enforced is vulnerable to additional complaint to the FAA. Everything to this point has been informal, verbal, and Part 16 is when the FAA conducts that official investigation into the matter and provides their ruling. So, the FAA, as done with the initial letter, advised that they do not view the current policy as fair and reasonable. So failure to meet our obligations of economic non-discrimination will place the airport at risk of non-compliance with our grant assurances. So what are the consequences if we end up with a Part 16 formal complaint? A formal FAA complaint is very likely to be filed against the airport without immediate action. They're very time-consuming, expensive to defend, and would require outside counsel to help us defend. Given the FAA's position in the initial notification provided, a ruling against the airport would be highly likely. And the AIP grant money that we count on so desperately will be in jeopardy until an acceptable plan is implemented and adopted. Again, resulting in that loss of funding to critical infrastructure and the safety improvements that are needed, such as the taxiway hotel extension, which will reduce runway crossings, which may not happen if we do not move forward with appropriate policy. So this slide walks through the first column here. You'll see points out the current policy, $200 annually, where it's very difficult to manage and enforce today because we don't know exactly who's out there operating, things of that nature, but we know that there are operations occurring. And it is counter to what staff recommended during the last go-around in 2017. I believe the recommendation was $2,400 annually, and it came down to $200 annually. So it's potentially, as it stands today, a violation of FAA policy. So we've looked at this a few different ways. We examined the ability to take a look at a tiered system. And that took a look at an independent instructor would pay depending upon the number of students they would instruct. We thought that might be a viable solution. Had some conversation with the FAA and realized that it's still going to be very difficult to enforce as students turn over with instructors and things of that nature. Failure to report that information to the airport on behalf of the instructor still leaves us vulnerable and may likely result in a violation of FAA policy of economic non-discrimination. So we move forward with the balanced approach, which is the recommended proposal today, where all instruction must go through an approved flight school with SBA with the appropriate fees charged, again, going back to the market rate. And revenue will be based upon the number of flight schools. Revenue for the airport will be based upon the number of flight schools and the flight training activity that's conducted. This makes enforcement much easier, but it will require additional manpower, staff, to help enforce. I think no matter how you look at this, it will require additional staff, enforcement staff, to monitor. Enforcement, sorry, I'm repeating myself there. And this was this policy that we're proposing today was developed from direct FAA guidance in order to avoid future complaints. We should mitigate all potential so that we could avoid complaint, or at least have a ruling in favor of the airport. It is fair to the lessees with their associated overhead costs, and it remedies the economic non-discrimination for the long term and is supported by the FAA. So what are those options? Well, there are currently 2 approved flight schools with qualified FAA certified flight instructors that are operating on the airport: Above All Aviation and Spitfire Aviation. We also have approved flying clubs. As I had mentioned earlier, instruction can occur from member to member within that flying club. This policy does not prohibit that because that is directly from the FAA order, so therefore we shall comply. Additionally, if those who may be conducting independent operations today, they have the opportunity to launch a new flight school that meets all approved minimum standards requirements. Some of those, speaking off the cuff, include an aircraft with at least 2 seats, a place to conduct ground school operations, so essentially a brick and mortar operation. But we also recognize that there are certain circumstances that may require a special considered permit, very limited in use because we believe that the vast majority of the flight instruction that's occurring can be accommodated with the options above. However, specific examples, if you were, let's say, looking for a type rating in a citation jet, for example, and the flight schools don't offer that, that option does need to be available to the users of the facility. So current challenges with other service providers, and this speaks back to the aircraft detailing and ground support equipment maintenance, for example. They were often launched businesses through initial contract work with tenants, perhaps the FBO. And they've grown legs, so to speak, where they're operating outside of the purview of the FBO, perhaps traveling over to the terminal apron to conduct ground support equipment maintenance, things of that nature. Again, it results in a potential loss of revenues for the airport. Again, going back to the certain business requirements that they may be potentially lacking. So again, direct competition with the brick and mortar tenants of the airport offering the same and or similar services goes back to the question of compliance with grant assurance number 22 that we were speaking of. And again, just like the others, very difficult to manage and enforce. So what we're proposing is that base brick and mortar tenants should have priority as a service provider. The independent service providers that directly compete with the brick and mortar tenants would be prohibited. Airport tenants would be prohibited from sponsoring airport approved contract service providers outside of their leasehold. So for example, a caterer coming in providing that service for a jet operator who, their needs may not be met by the on airport food service options. And then all tenants operating on the airport must meet, again, the business requirements that we spoke of. Fair and equal competition would be required, and the airport must generate revenue for the use of its facilities and resources. As we spoke about, that's what funds the operation here, as we receive no local tax dollars. So the path to compliance for us. The reason why we're here today, we're looking for approval of a strategy for addressing FAA compliance, of the FAA compliance issue specific to the flight instruction. Notification to the FAA of this proposal of all commercial service activity at the airport, and implementation of a program to address non-compliance of other commercial service operators. This will also, again, include designating enforcement staff to monitor compliance, and then take appropriate action when violations occur. And then finally, as Henry alluded to, we would have to update the SBA minimum standards, coming back to the Airport Commission, and ultimately then on to City Council. So speaking to the due diligence that was conducted, we conducted a survey of over 60 airports of similar size when we look at their service level by the number of enplanements. And what we found is 80% of those commercial airports report that independent commercial service operators are prohibited when operating in competition with direct tenants. The other 20% may be operating out of compliance. but overwhelming majority of airports do report that this is the proposal before you today is the way that they operate. Additionally, the same holds true for independent flight instructors. 80% do not allow independent flight instruction because of the competition factor. And it is consistent with our FAA policy to treat all equally. So, as you are aware, public comment was sent to the email address provided there. We received 30 written comments as of 8:40 on November 18th. And what I'm going to do here is just kind of touch on some of the bullet points of the generalized, summarized comments that were received. You know, we heard that there's a desire to have a choice in hiring a specific flight instructor given qualifications and experience. However, that's in conflict with FAA guidance. Independent instructors bring additional business to SBA. However, that business conflicts with the FAA and city requirements. Independent instructors have been devastating to local businesses. That is consistent with the FAA guidance to correct. And then economic discrimination may go if independents are eliminated. However, it's consistent with the FAA guidance on the development of this policy. And we've also heard, again, as Henry mentioned, that this item should be delayed until it can be studied further. The FAA is requiring us to handle this item now. As you recall, we spoke in a retreat not too long ago about the one-year time frame that we're looking at, and we're there. So we need to move forward on this in order to avoid that any further interrogation, so to speak. We've also heard that this is creating a monopoly on the airport. However, there are 2 flight schools, and there are many opportunities to open more. We would gladly entertain any proposal to open up a new flight school within our leased spaces, as long as they meet the minimum requirements. Flying clubs should not Flying clubs should not permit student pilots as members. However, FAA permits flight instructions when it's from member to member. So some of those would be students, and I don't think that we would want to eliminate that. There was no timely notification to the public of the need to make this change. However, this item was first publicly introduced to the Commission with the recommendation for change on November 26, 2018, after the complaint letter was received by the FAA. There was no reasonable time for public input. We specifically requested public input on November 8th, 2019. This is also potentially creating an exclusive operator. However, again, as I alluded to, new flight schools can still be opened here on the airport. We heard that safety will be diminished. However, we do have compliant FAA qualified and certificated flight instructors that exist at the current schools. So they meet the FAA standards for providing flight instruction. Specialized instruction would not be permitted. However, as I alluded to then, specialized activities will be evaluated on a case-by-case basis when it's not being met by the local operators. The proposal eliminates the choice of flight instructor. However, flight instructor choice will be determined by those that operate in compliance here on the facility. Well, what about flight instruction that originates off the airport? However, we cannot prohibit transient pilots who are operating transient aircraft because they don't fall under the airport's minimum standards. So if someone were to fly in from another facility and they were flying in the pattern, that would not change. The airport must meet the needs of the community. But the grant funding that provides for the airport is in jeopardy due to this activity, which would not allow us to meet the community. We heard that the issue was resolved in 2017, but the resolution resulted in the FAA's finding that further changes are needed, which is why we're here before you today. This is only an informal or verbal complaint. No action is needed, right? Well, the FAA reiterated that non-compliance and failure to update will result in a violation. We heard that we should lower the rent for the flight schools. That may level the playing field. However, we must charge market rate, and that's not in the best interest of the city of Santa Barbara. The airport must be available to all users. Users that comply are the ones that we're interested in. Current flight instructors on the field are unfamiliar with high performance or complex aircraft. Well, independent flight instructors specializing in this line of business are limiting exposure to compliant instructors, as, for example, flight schools may not be able to do that today because it's currently being performed by independents. So it is thereby hurting our existing flight schools. And then aircraft maintenance, oils for oil changes, for example, in compliance with CFR Part 43 was reported as a violation. However, specific practices cited are not in compliance with the state-approved stormwater pollution prevention plan. So again, looking at the survey, airport staff, we've reached out, spoken with industry consultants that are very familiar with the creation of minimum standards, rules and regulations on facilities. And their feedback was that this is the most secure route towards compliance with the FAA policy and consistent with a large majority of the airports, again, looking back to our survey results. So I can't see the date up there, November 19th, I think is what that was saying, 13th. We received a letter from the FAA with support of the proposal that is before you today. So what are we here to recommend? Well, we're recommending that we implement the proposed policy that limits flight instruction to the approved flight schools or flying clubs that are operating at the airport. Unpermitted independent flight instruction activity would not be allowed. Implement policy that requires all commercial service providers, again, those providing services other than flight instruction, that desire to provide these services airport-wide must be under a lease with the airport and meet those business requirements consistent with all tenant lease agreements. Again, this goes back to the equal and fair treatment. And then finally, we would prepare the associated minimum standards update to officially seek approval of these changes from the Commission and City Council. And with that, I will open it up to any questions that you may have.
Okay, fellow commission members, why don't we start left to right?
Oh, boy, okay.
You want to hear public comment first?
We do airport commission first, public comment after that.
Where do we start? Gosh, if this was my business, I'd say, how did this happen? My gosh, $200 to operate on airport property? How did this happen? Does anyone have an answer for this? I mean, I go to the building department to get a trellis installed, and it's a $2,000 building permit. Seems like every time I interface with the city, it's $1,000. How did we get down to $200?
Well, I can speak to that. There was a methodology to how they got to this $200 fee the last time, and it was based upon what the original fee was, which was only $150 and had not been increased. And so at the time, I believe the commissioners that were involved in that negotiation believed that increasing it by $50 was fair, and that's the reason for that. How did this happen? This has evolved over time. This problem has existed for quite some time on this airport, and Santa Barbara Airport isn't alone in this. This problem occurs at other airports also. And we did make an attempt to try to address this before tonight, the last time around. We just weren't successful at doing it. So, time has caught up with us because the FAA has made note that Santa Barbara Airport is not in compliance, and so we're catching up right now.
Okay. Deanna, is there a facility right now of these 30 pilots who they're very articulate, they're highly educated, very bright people, with obviously some means? Could they combine together with their resources and start a flight school on airport property within the next 30 to 60 days? Is there a building for them?
Well, first of all, thank you, Commissioner. First of all, there aren't actually that many certified flight instructors with the FAA residing in the nearby community. It's pretty easy to look on the FAA's website and see how many folks actually could provide flight instruction. So that's actually a pretty limited population of folks.
Okay.
But we do have some small office space. I mean, obviously, if you're a flight instructor, you're spending the majority of your time, in an aircraft or out on the ramp. But yeah, we do have some small spaces that would be appropriate for that. It would really all depend if there were folks that wanted to join forces together and start a flight school, more flight schools on the field back in time. So, and we're obviously willing to do everything we can to work to accommodate that.
Okay. What about, I'm thinking about our Sky Bridge, our $1.1 million Sky Bridge going to Gate 3. And if this proposal's turned down, is that in jeopardy?
Well, that project's well underway and should be completed within the next month, so that specific project will not be impacted. But we do have federal dollars that are, in fact, in the pipeline now that would be placed on hold until this matter is resolved.
And how long could such a resolution take?
I would say months if we, really focused on it and put it on a fast track. And again, I say that knowing that we've already put a lot of time into this, months into the recommendation that we bring before you today. So it's a considerable effort, just to try and re-examine it and look at other options, other workable options, because there's certainly other options out there, but whether or not we can administer them, enforce them, and implement them, that's the real question. So there would be significant time involved in a redo.
Okay. And my other concern is I come from the most highly regulated pharmaceutical industry, highly regulated industry in the United States, the pharmaceutical biotechnology industry. And I learned from one CEO who sued the FDA that they have very long memories. And so I've always learned, don't fight the Fed. It's more than just Warren Buffett talking about, don't fight the Fed, okay? But you don't only have the FAA, you also have TSA. And we haven't even talked about the TSA reviewing these documents and seeing, are there compliance issues? Are there people in the airport listed in these letters we don't know? Who are these people? Why aren't we tracking them more effectively? How do we know if they're fully compliant with the regulations?
And I would just respond that this issue is on the TSA's radar as well. In fact, I've spoken with our federal security director and made assurances that we are addressing the matter. The TSA is going to make every effort to not step into it because their partner agency has already taken regulatory action to correct the situation. So there is potential TSA risk involved here as well, as I spoke of earlier.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
I can actually answer one of your questions, the very first one, why $200? Actually, 150 was set. That was 10 years or approximately later that this came up. Most of the leases on the airport increased by LA CPI, not less than 3, not more than 8%. Taking $150, adding 3% per year for the length of time that it had not been adjusted, came into within pennies of being $200. The agreement at the time was that it would be $200 a year and that it would increase by the LA CPA not less than 3, not 8% every year thereafter. It's my understanding that the airport has not increased, it has not sent out bills with those increases, but that is how it came about.
And let me just clarify as well, excuse me. Staff's recommendation at the time this deal was negotiated, staff's recommendation was for a fee of $2,400. So understanding the methodology, there was a wide disparity between the two. And, again, the FAA looked at, the base fee of $200 and deemed that problematic. So however we got here, it really doesn't matter at this point. We're here and the FAA has evaluated the situation and deemed us in a problematic situation.
Well, continuing as to why the 200, there were at the time 2 independent flight instructors who were working full-time. There was one working at most half-time. That one, to the best of my knowledge, no longer offers instruction here. And one of the 2 that was full-time is significantly less than that, going into retirement, cutting back. The other half a dozen, 10, something like that, were all very, very part-time, giving flight instruction of 10 or 20 hours a year. You, not being a pilot, may not understand that every pilot must undergo a biennial flight review, which is an hour of flying. Some pilots, especially older ones, I guess, also have to undergo an instrument proficiency check once a year, about an hour and a half of flying. The majority of the independent flight instructors that talked about and complained about $2,400 a year said, hey, wait a minute, I do a half a dozen BFRs or 3 or 4 IPCs a year. You know, I'm talking about 15 hours of flight instruction. You want $2,400? That's totally unreasonable. That's how we came up with $200. There was,
with respect, Carl, I'll maybe just ask you, in the interest of time, to move on. Did we have questions?
I was trying to make clear how we came up with that and why $2,400 was not a reasonable amount. You mentioned in one of the document that everything would have to go through flight schools and fees would be charged. What type of fees are you talking about? I mean, flight schools already pay lease and insurance and whatever. Are there some other fees for flight instructors going through flight schools being proposed?
So that was specific to the fees that the flight schools would be charging for the flight instruction. No additional fees to the airport. So to that point, to answer your question, it would be the airport would just receive the lease revenues, but there's no additional fee. It's just the flight instruction fee that the flight school would charge to the student.
You also mentioned that an additional employee would be required to monitor this. Are you talking about an additional FTE, a full-time employee, to being added to the existing staff in order to monitor this process?
That's correct. Based upon staffing numbers, we believe that we would have to have someone dedicated to monitoring and enforcing because of the complex nature of what is occurring.
And I'll just add that regardless of what new policy we come up with, we've been deficient in our enforcement, and so regardless of what the solution, additional resources for monitoring and enforcing and following up on these issues would be required.
Now, I think you've answered this, but I made some notes based on what was on the agenda before this slide presentation, but I'd still like to go through it. There are, to the best of my knowledge, 2 aircraft detailers on the field now. Both of them lease spaces from FBOs. I believe one of them leases a space from both Signature and Atlantic. The other one leases space from Atlantic. Neither of them, though, are affiliated with the FBO. They just lease office space, and then they conduct their business on the airfield. How does this policy affect them, if at all?
I'll just say that there's another operator that is operating through the fence, and that is something that we need to address as part of our operation. So the other detailers are currently, as to your point, leasing space.
So those detailers that are leasing space are doing everything correctly today, and there would be no change under the new policy?
Let me just clarify that for you, because you just stated a very good example of one of the challenges we have. In that example you describe, those 2 service providers are subleasing space from the FBO, okay? And the airport, aside from issuing them their airfield access credential, We don't know anything about those individuals as far as whether or not they're meeting the airport's and city's requirements for insurance, hold harmless agreements, business licenses. Their relationship is with the FBO, and they should technically only be conducting business within the confines of the FBO's property line. Once they gravitate outside of that FBO's property line, then they should be meeting the city's requirements, and that's one of the challenges. Are they? We don't know today. We have no idea.
So how would this proposal, how would that affect them? What would they have to do to become compliant?
So that's another very good question. How we get from where we are today to where we need to be, those are the details that come in the next phase of this discussion. So tonight here, we're not here to provide the specific policy. We're just here to lay the path in the direction that we're headed. We still have to flush out the details of the policy and the specific changes to the minimum standards, and that's what you're talking about right now.
Then, so if a flight school or an FBO were to decide to go into the detailing business, that would not negate these two that are currently operating from continuing to operate. Is that correct? There's no preference to one or the other? I mean, a detailer can be a completely independent operation?
So again, in the examples that you cited there, those individuals are not currently tenants of the airport. They are tenants of the FBO. And again, technically, they should only be operating within the confines of the FBO, only conducting or providing commercial services in that area. The problem that we're having and why we're here tonight is because they've entered the airport through the FBO, for example, and now they've migrated around the entire airport. And we have no idea exactly, we know who they are because we have vetted these folks. I want to be clear about that. They have been vetted for security purposes. But from a business perspective, we don't know a whole lot about them.
Right now, they are the FBO's responsibility.
That is correct. However, they're operating well outside of the FBO's property.
So the one, though, that is renting from both Signature and Atlantic presumably would be in compliance, excepting if they were dealing with airport hangar or tie down.
And again, those are the details that we're going to figure out in the next phase of this.
Flight instructors. First question, does this policy apply only if they are being paid for flight instruction?
Clarify.
There are flight instructors who give flight instruction without being paid for it, without monetary compensation. They may do it for a friend. Instructor A may give a BFR to Instructor B on the trip that way, and vice versa on the trip back, etc.
And again, you're citing an example that we can't enforce. We don't know when they're doing it for pay or not, and that's part of the reason why we're headed down the path we're headed.
Well, but my question is, are you proposing that a person doing flight instruction at no charge would also be covered by this policy and have to go through a flight school?
Again, those are the details that we have to work out. We don't have the answer to every scenario that you're going to come up with here today. We'll examine that and see how we can enforce that and how that fits into the policy.
So I think you got this pretty well covered. If a CFI is a member of a flying club, giving instruction to a member of the same flying club in an aircraft owned by that flying club, it is not this policy. It is currently that is currently legal, meets the policy, and it would meet the new proposed policy. Is that correct?
That is accurate. That's directly from the FAA order 5190, I believe is what it was. Yeah.
Okay, I'm getting the high sign over here that he'd like me to finish, but there are a number of other questions that I'd have. But I would like to point out to, you mentioned 5190 dot 6 Bravo. And in that, amongst other things, there is an Appendix O. Appendix O is a sample minimum standards, MSR. I don't know what the R stands for, but minimum standard regulation or something. And in Article 6 of this sample, now I'm assuming this sample was given by the FAA, and I'm going to assume that they gave us a good sample, not an example of what we shouldn't do, but rather of an example of what we should do. And Article 6, flight instruction, the first paragraph. All independent flight instructors, defined as giving instruction only in student-owned aircraft, are exempt from this article of the minimum standards. The rest of it then talks about flight schools. So my question would be, why is the FAA individual that you're speaking with in LA saying you can't have independent flight instructors when the sample MSR in the federally published document says they are exempt from that aspect of the minimum standards?
Well, I'll speak to that in that, that is a sample, it is an option, and there are many options on the table. However, the FAA has advised us that the safest option for continued compliance would be to remove that from the SBA minimum standards document after conversing both with the LA office and through their counterparts in Washington, D.C.
Well, I think you should take this and show it to the individual you're speaking with in LA and ask them to explain why the published document says it's perfectly legal and he's saying that it isn't. He or she is saying that it isn't. That it seems to me quite clear that it is perfectly reasonable, based on FAA's published documentation that I just found by Googling it, based on what Mr. Thompson thankfully pointed me to, that says it is legal.
And let me just do a little bit of follow-up there. So the FAA is not directing us in the direction of a very specific policy. We have many, many options in which we could, go with a policy on this. However, that policy is one in which we have to be able to effectively implement. We have to be able to administer the program, and we have to be able to enforce it. So the example that's cited there may be for an airport that is a different type of an airport that has sufficient measures in place or staffing in place to be able to enforce that policy. The policy, as you described it, is not one I'm comfortable we could enforce here in Santa Barbara. Again, the reason we're here today is because we're not able to enforce the existing policy that's in place.
A couple more questions, please.
Yeah, I won't cut you off. I just figured we'd probably beat that one.
If a flight instructor leases an office space from the airport, could they then give flight instruction to an individual who owns an aircraft?
I mean, I believe that would be the concept of operating a flight school.
No, a flight school, an instructor gives instruction in the flight school aircraft. What we're talking about is, and that's, generally flight schools give flight instruction in their aircraft, their instructors in their aircraft. They know that aircraft well. When an individual who owns an aircraft wants instruction, they go to an independent. So I'm asking if the independent flight instructor, like the detailer, like the ground mechanics, like the leases a space, an office space from the airport, can they then conduct training in the student's own aircraft?
So that would be dependent upon the policies that would be updated in the new minimum standards document. So should that be desired, that would be a discussion when we start reviewing the current minimum standards for the procedural updates.
So I think what Henry has pointed out a few times is the details aren't all worked out. I'm not stopping you, just clarifying that what you have told us up to this point, and I also have questions, but what you've told us up to this point is a path, a direction, and some background behind why, and the details of which are yet to be determined. Is that accurate?
That's absolutely correct. You can come up with any number of theoretical situations, and a lot of them will be, evaluated on a case-by-case basis once we have a policy in place. We are literally starting from scratch to some degree, and this is the very first step in identifying our intent to go in a different direction than we are today. But we very much have to work out the details of the minimum standards, which will address some of these scenarios that are being brought up.
However, I understand details, but the question that I asked, I think, is an extremely important one. Because if the answer is yes, that is proposed policy as you see it today that you're asking us to approve, states that if an independent flight instructor leases an office space from the city, from the airport, that then that instructor can give lessons to pilots in their own aircraft. If that is the answer, I suspect that a significant amount of the angst that we're soon to hear about will likely go away, because a full-time flight instructor can easily afford to rent 100 square feet of office space, and 6 or 8 or 10 of them would probably chip in and join him or her. So we're talking about remember, we're talking about one full-time, one half-time, and a bunch of 20, 30-hour-a-year people on the field. So it's a very, very important question, because as presented here, the answer is no. They have to go through a flight school.
Well, let me try and answer it again in a theoretical, response. Again, if that proposal came to the airport, we would have to evaluate that business proposal that's being presented and make sure that it's not in conflict with our obligations to be fair and to treat everyone equally. Competition is good, and we would welcome competition, but we have to make sure that it doesn't conflict with the business that's already being offered on the airport, and we end up in another potential situation. So theoretically, it might work out. We'd have to look and see what the requirements would be for that theoretical operator and make sure that there's a level playing field. That's the best response we can give you.
Okay, let's assume that you end up saying no, that all, as been presented here, both on this document as well as earlier, that all flight instruction must take place through a flight school. Let us assume for a moment, and I'm a flight instructor, currently an independent flight instructor. Sounds to me like if I want to conduct my business, which in at least one instance is my livelihood, I have to be hired as an employee by one of the 2 flight schools, which is very limiting and means that they can pay me whatever they choose, and they have no incentive to pay me a whole lot, and they can charge whatever they want, whatever markup they wish. Am I understanding the proposal correctly? And by the way, they might not hire me because they don't like me.
Right. So let me just clarify things a little bit for you there, because as you just described it, you said all flight instruction must occur through a flight school. What we have shared with you tonight is that flight instruction should occur, number one, through one of our approved flight schools on the airport. Number two, member to member in a flight club. Number three, there's the option to start a new flight school if they so wish to do so. And then number four, if they're providing a service that's not already being provided by one of the flight schools on the airport, then there's an option for a permit. So just to clarify, you limited it, but there are options that are available to provide flight instruction.
So I think I would ask, just in the interest, because I know we have a lot of public comment to get through. And again,
I'll just like one more comment, and then I'll
thank you.
let you.
And just to point out, it's not comment, it's question.
Okay, well, I have to comment on the response because starting a flight school isn't an answer for me, independent flight instructor, because I'm not giving instruction in the flight school airplane, I'm giving instruction in the student's airplane. I'm not giving specialized instruction, I'm giving standard, ordinary BFRs and IPCs, and maybe work somebody on a commercial or an instrument rating. So, and a flying club doesn't do me any good because it's my airplane. I don't want to take lessons in the flying club airplane, which is totally different than my airplane. So we are back to, if I'm a run-of-the-mill flight instructor teaching in a bunch of different aircraft or ability, and have people who want to hire me, I think you're practically saying I must be hired by one of the flight schools. And I have severe problems with that.
Sounds to me like
I've
Carl is.
answered it.
Sounds to me like Carl. It sounds to me like Carl is volunteering his time to spend time with you on this subject. I'm sure.
I have asked for more than one meeting on this, on various subjects with the director, and I'm waiting for him to get back to me.
Any other questions, sir?
No.
Okay, I'll go off to my right, maybe Paul.
Oh, okay. I thought I was gonna be the tail end guy on this. I think getting back to the big issues here, because we really don't have the policy done. Carl's questions are not addressed. They're, even though we are adopting the proposed policy change, I don't see a policy yet, other than banning flight instruction except at flight schools. So my concern is our airport improvement grant funds, and that's where I'm going to direct my questions. Henry, do you foresee legal action being taken against the airport and the city over this issue?
I cannot predict legal action or complaints being filed, but we would, respond appropriately to any such challenges that came up on this matter.
Okay, and you probably can't respond on the approximate cost of that.
No, I could not.
Okay, I'm working on it. Our issue is with the FAA and making sure we get our grant money. That's it. I mean, we've addressed some other issues like insurance, hold harmless clause, and getting that enforced. Clearly, we need to protect the airport. I'm all for that. Do you foresee any problems from other groups such as AOPA coming after us, not at your local FAA office, but from the top down to them? And do we have risk if we implement this policy that these pressure groups will succeed in holding up our grant funding due to the numerous written complaints that are sure to follow?
No, I cannot predict that, number one. Number two, I'm comfortable with the recommendation that we're bringing before the commission today, and that is in the direction that we're going with the details of the policy to come out further. I'm comfortable that we are in a good position with the policy that we're recommending to you tonight to withstand any challenge coming from any direction. And I'm comfortable and confident with that because we've spent a lot of time on this particular issue. We've done our due diligence, and we've done that in step with the FAA. So that gives me a high degree of confidence that we are bringing before you the right decision for the airport.
Okay. Bear with me for a minute as I get myself organized, because I did think I was going to be the last end guy. That's all right. I'll wing it here. It seems that we had a lot of policy issues that were not enforced as far as insurance and keeping track of this. Your solution, as I understand it, is to, at some point, put in the budget to have a full-time enforcer on this?
We'll be adding an additional position to help us begin enforcement, which we really haven't been able to do a lot of, and that's part of the reason why we're here today.
So it's safe to say that the independents that followed the rules watched other people not follow the rules.
Again, I don't know what the independents have been doing. What I can comment on is that there's a lot of activity that is going on at the airport where the rules are not being followed, and a lot of activities, commercial activities, that we're just unsure of. And that's what we're trying to do, come up with a policy that really gives us the ability to be able to administer and enforce all of this activity that we're responsible for.
On the flight instruction activity, three options are thrown to us. Was there other options that are not being presented today?
Absolutely. Again, option one is the existing option, which we looked at initially at how we might modify the existing policy to get to where we needed to get to. And, every direction we went with that particular option, it again came down to we could not enforce it, and therefore we would find ourselves eventually where we are again today. Option number two, the tiered system, we looked at numerous ways of approaching that type of a system. And again, it's not something that's enforceable because there's too much activity independently occurring out there today to where we just can't manage it. And so option three, again, was an option that flushed out and made sense. It met all of our objectives. And it was an option that came out in our discussions with the FAA, in which we shared all of those other options. And they agreed that any of those other options that we might pursue, we would likely find ourselves in the same non-compliant situation. So I realize option three is not a desired one, but it does put the airport in the best position to be able to manage this activity on airport property, which we're obligated to do first and foremost. And then it allows us to be able to ensure that we're in compliance with FAA regulations. So we've looked at a whole host of scenarios. We shared with you the main three core options, but there were many variations.
Under not desirable options, did you consider not allowing any flight instruction?
Absolutely, we did. And, I heard that referred to as draconian, and I just didn't think that was a feasible option, particularly since we have two approved flight schools already on the airport that are providing that service.
Okay. Yes, no, I'm not proposing that. But what I'm looking for is the process that got us to where we're at now, at this very late date, with the FAA about to shut us down as far as our grant money. I'm looking at the issues on notification. As you'll notice, when we're going to hear from a lot of people that did not see this coming, we did not have a process to involve the airport community to get to this stage. You and I discussed this months ago, and then it's not been talked about since. You indicated you wanted to be in, I forget your exact words, stealth or secret mode, or, but don't worry, you're going to come up with something good, because I described it to you as the intractable problem and that I'd be very proud of you if you could pull a rabbit out of the hat and solve this. I hate to say it, I am not proud of the solution at all. Please, no. Let's keep the decorum. I'm not seeking applause and that kind of thing. This is between us going here. So I'm very, very concerned that this is going to create tremendous battles here at the airport, legal fees, and that numerous written complaints will still occur, and the result will be our FAA funding is still cut off because we have not engaged the airport community. We have not successfully worked this process, and it's painfully obvious that we have failed to do so. Our subcommittee meeting that was probably not appropriately announced in time on a 3-day weekend, that whole thing makes us look very bad.
So, Mr. Rowan, I was just going to maybe urge you to ask the question.
Okay. So what I'm looking for is, based upon the problems that we're having, what can we do to engage the community and solve this problem?
So the first thing I would say is that, and I stated this earlier in my comments, this is not a new issue, okay?
True.
And we have been working on this issue for the past 9 months that I've been director of this airport. And this is not the singular issue that we've been dealing with. We've been managing an airport as well.
Mm-hmm.
But we've been doing our work, very hard work, and appropriate due diligence to make sure that we're getting to the solution that we bring to you tonight. And when it was appropriate and we had something to share, we did share that information with the commission and with the public. And again, I want to emphasize that what we're bringing to you today is, a commitment to resolve the FAA issue and a clear intent on the direction in which we're going in. Now, the details of that, again, will occur in the next phase, and there will be more discussion. There will be more public opportunity for input of those details. One of the things that we were particularly looking for during the open public period, public comment period that we had for written responses, is we were looking for other options, other alternatives, aside from what we're bringing to you today. And none of the 30 responses that we received provided feasible alternatives. And so, there will be more discussion on this issue after tonight, but I feel that we've made, a good effort to make sure that we did what we should be doing, and that is engaging and doing the appropriate due diligence. And the solution that we have, again, is well-founded with support from the FAA, who is ultimately our regulator.
I have no doubt of your staff has been working very hard and diligently, and thank you for all the effort that's occurred to run this airport while dealing with these side issues like this. What I'm pointing out and trying to ask is, how do we engage the airport community so that they're involved, that we're staying out of lawsuits, we're staying out of FAA challenges? That's what I'm seeking from you.
So again, I can't predict complaints. I can't predict lawsuits. But should those occur, then we will address them appropriately. And again, in response to your question, during the next phase, there will be more open discussion and opportunities for public input as we move forward, and prior to bringing the minimum standards to this body first.
Okay, so I have a question for you. Our agenda item is that we adopt the proposed policy change. In a sense, we're adopting a policy, but I feel like we're granting you an open, We don't get to, the policy isn't done yet, but we're gonna adopt the policy. I have issues with that. And I'm not gonna ask you what the proposed policy is, because we've already stated that that's in process.
So there's no question there.
Yeah.
Okay.
So second question, or probably my last question, is I read in the news press a very good article this morning that was news to me that this has to be approved by the city council. Is that true?
Again, in the next phase, the minimum standards updates or changes that we make will have to come to the airport commission and then ultimately to the city council for approval, yes.
And why is it that that goes to city council for approval?
Minimum standards?
Yes.
They're the rules that are governing the operation of the airport, and so the city council does ultimately approve them.
Interesting. I have no further questions, Chairman.
Commissioner Chair Curie and Commissioner Bowen, it's the Santa Barbara Municipal Code and Title 18 that provides the duties and powers to the commission, and one of those duties is to provide information and a recommendation to the city council with regards to the rules that are imposed upon airport use. So the minimum standards are those, so it's your obligation as part of your role is to review the proposed rules and make a recommendation to council. And with regards to the request for the recommendation, it's up to the commission how they want to craft their motion. You could do something along the lines of make a motion to accept the policy path direction as proposed with further study as into the details, something along those lines. I'm happy to help you craft a motion if you want more direction. Otherwise, of course, I'll leave it up to you. It's your motion, but I'm here if you need any help.
Thanks, Tava, and I think we'll be asking for your help here in a few minutes. I know I will be.
I have both a question and hopefully a succinct comment, if I might be permitted. The question is my understanding correct that what we're doing tonight is just saying we want to develop new minimum standards? And that is what we are going to be asked to approve here within the commission tonight.
So the objective or the objective of your motion and your action here today, again, is to go on the record committing to addressing the concerns that have been raised by the FAA, number one, and number two, making clear our intent to address that issue by moving in the direction that we shared with you in our proposal today.
Yeah, thank you. My comment is that in the airport industry, there's a continuum from dirt crop duster strips alongside farmers' fields to large international airports. And SBA is on that line. And as we grow, we're forced to evolve. And what we're facing tonight is the next step in evolution. Evolution brings uncertainty, which brings discomfort, but we all have to face that. All of us in the room tonight are in the same boat. We're all in different seats, so it must be a pretty good-sized boat. But the bottom line is, if the FAA pulls the plug of grant eligibility, the boat will sink and we will all drown. Thank you.
Thanks, Mr. Wilson. So I have a couple of questions. Did I understand you to say at some point in the questions or conversation or presentation that, although I realize that the details of which are not worked out, if there are services needed, whether it's flight instruction or maintenance or some sort of services needed that just plumb are not offered by any brick and mortar operation on the field, whether it's maintenance or avionics or flight instruction, you intend on, while you work out these details, is it correct to say that you intend on developing a procedure to deal with that? And I would say, my own little comment, in a timely way, meaning, sometimes the government says, don't worry, I'll help you, fill out this form and I'll not call you back in 3 months. So is it your intention to work out, when you work out the details, to provide for some ability for services, whatever they may be, that are not offered by any brick and mortar tenant on the airport? Do you intend on addressing that?
So that is accurate, yes. So we will take a look as the requests are made, take a look, examine whether or not those services are being provided, and then on a case-by-case basis, if the situation merits that commercial activity be provided, because again, going back to a type rating, for example, on an aircraft, we don't want to exclude the ability to obtain a citation jet, for example. We don't want to exclude the ability for that instruction to occur. So that is something that we could permit, yes.
It's a follow-up question to that. So today, since if we head down the path of adding a full-time equivalent to manage this and probably other things, so today, if I wanted to reach out to the airport to provide some sort of service, to whom would I reach out?
So that's actually handled through the Airport Business Development Department through Deanna's division.
Through Deanna?
Yes.
Okay. Alrighty, and I had a number of questions that I think are probably broadly covered by we haven't worked out the details yet. As a flight instructor, there are certain things I can do as a flight instructor based on my ratings that maybe others can't. I see Elwood here in the audience. He's a phenomenal tail dragger pilot. If I were going to get some tail dragger instruction, that's where I would go first. So it is correct to say that over the next, what period of time are you going to be working on these details?
So we're already behind on resolving this matter, and to avoid further action being taken, we're going to have to move fairly swiftly on, developing those policies and getting them approved through the process.
Okay. So does that mean that you will be back before us? Do you expect to be back before us in a month with new minimum standards?
I would say within 1 to 2 months, given the holidays that are quickly approaching. We're going to work as quickly as we can and get the necessary input before we come back to you.
Have you communicated our expediency to the FAA folks?
We have, and they've concurred with the path that we've laid forward, and they've documented that in a letter that is in front of you there as well. Okay.
And then one final question, which a little bit echoes Commissioner Bowen's question. And I think that's where I'm going to request some help from Teva, and we're getting to public comment in just a moment. Two recommendations here: that we adopt the proposed policy change prohibiting independent commercial service providers, including flight instruction on the airport, and that we update the minimum standards. I might ask you, Teva, this isn't, it is a question. I might ask you to be thinking in your mind, I don't think it's inappropriate to acknowledge that the word adopt implies there's something before us. It's been codified, we've beaten it up or discussed it, and we're ready to adopt it. And I'm going to ask you to think while we're doing public comment about helping me craft a motion that A, allows the airport to move forward in an expeditious manner, but B, doesn't leave the impression for everybody that we have already worked out the details, they're done, we're ready to adopt it. Because I think that's a little bit farther out than where we are. So I might ask you, Teva, to think about that. Any other commissioners have any other questions? Okay, with that then, I'm going to open public comment. Before I call the first person up, so again, want to remind everybody of decorum. I want to ask you to kind of look in my direction at 2 minutes and 45 seconds. Looks like I've got about 45 minutes of speaker slips, which is 3x longer than we typically allow for this. I'm going to give everybody, Mo, go ahead and bring that up. We're going to give everybody a chance to speak. Please just be respectful. Before I call the first person, thank you, Mo. I want to, for the record, note that we received 30 written comment letters to the either to the airport director and/or to the public comment email website that was set up. I'm going to read every one of them right now. Actually, I'm going to read the names of the people who supplied them. Landon Nevins, Paul Trent, Max Rosenberg, Jeff Beal, I apologize if I butcher a name, Tom Carlisle, Mike Fontaine ×2, Terry Harris ×2, Mary Bromage, George Powell, Vince, how do you pronounce your last name? Vince Merstick ×4, Joseph Moore, Elwood Shapansky, Adrian Kelcraft, Justin Robertson, Jasmine Kova, Greg Darrenfield, James Watson, TJ Ferguson, Chris Salas, Larry Cochran, James Lotus, Zach North, Devin Darrenfield, Aaron Green, and Robert Rice. So just for the record, those folks sent in written comments. I just wanted to note that. I'm not trying to make light of the situation, though, of course, I'm not going to read all of those. So with that, we'll open this up for public comment. And the first one here is Jared. How do you pronounce your last name, Jared? Bradley. Jared Bradley. So Jared, step up to the mic and please speak clearly so we can all hear you.
So I'm a newly licensed pilot as of this year. This comment, I do want to say I appreciate all the work you guys put in. I do think that I'm concerned we have a major pilot shortage in this country. And the actions that we're taking are not going to make it easier to become a pilot. Furthermore, the time you put in is just to adopt a policy that other airports already have. I do think we can do a better job if we involve more of our community in this process. The fact that it was done, quote, in secrecy, also adopting a policy that everyone else has, because essentially one person's unhappy, and there are people that are on property that you could probably, with security, deal with those issues if they're not where they're supposed to be, because I do see airport patrols. I'm concerned that we have a bunch of wealthy people in this room, and we're just making this continually to be, if you want to get a pilot's license, you got to pay a lot of money, because it reduces options for people. So we have a community that is very diverse. This room is not very diverse, and it's not very diverse because of policies like this that make it extremely expensive to become a pilot. And some of the independent instructors that I've worked with are, I find, to be highly professional with 30 plus years of experience, as has been indicated by Mr. Hopkins. And those are not the people that you can get when you go to said flight school. Plus, one of the flight schools doesn't even answer their phone. And we don't even know if they have any employees. So, I just want to say, look around us. We have a huge pilot shortage. It's not being addressed by the expensive on-site operator we have. And I had to wait a long time as a teacher in this community to save the money to become a pilot. So keep in mind that we should make being a pilot should be available to everyone. I know you said it's a privilege to be a pilot or be on site. Sure, I agree with that. You have to meet certain requirements, and being wealthy should not be one of them.
Mr. McBride.
Excuse me. Airport staff, commissioners, My name is Bill McBride. I own Coastal Aircraft Maintenance on field. We've been here for about 10 years, and obviously we lease a large space, so we have a significant interest in this. But we do understand and agree that there's going to be, I'll speak only to maintenance on this, not anything about flight instruction. We do agree and understand that there will be need to have other maintenance providers on this field to do services that either we can't do or busy or don't have the technical expertise, or they're OEMs, for example, doing stuff under warranty. We understand that. And, we're willing to work with the airport staff or whomever in order to let them understand, what we can and can't do and how we might support other maintenance providers' access to the field. We're not new to this. I mean, we operate outside of Santa Barbara Airport. And we operate, for example, at LAX. We operate at Oakland. We operate at SFO. We operate at San Jose. And we play by the rules, as was discussed earlier. What do? We have to lease space there. We have to get a city license in all of those cities. We have to obviously provide insurance certificates, et cetera, workers' comp stuff. And in some cases, we pay a revenue-based tax on the revenues that we achieve at those airports to those respective cities. So maintenance providers understand that. They'll do that. They will still continue to come to Santa Barbara Airport and follow the rules that all the other airports have already implemented, similar to this. Thanks.
Elwood Shapansky.
Thank you. I've been flying out of Santa Barbara Airport since 1961, when runway 21 was the active runway and Air Exec was the main fixed base operator, now occupied by Atlantic. I have never encountered, and by the way, I've been a freelance flight instructor since 1965. I taught the aeronautics program at Santa Barbara City College from 1965 until 1983, when Proposition 13 eliminated our program and said that because it's available in fixed base operators on the field, it can't be taught and paid for by taxpayers' money at Santa Barbara City College. Until that time, I had hundreds of students. I have numerous airline pilots. I have so much positive feedback, mostly or often from wives and relatives of pilots who want to know more about the business. But what's relevant right now is something that hasn't been talked about, and you need to know it. This move we're talking about will limit aviation education in a tremendous amount. For this reason, I don't know what happens here in Santa Barbara, but most of the flight schools throughout the United States now will offer their students who complete a flight instructor's rating a job so that they can build up the time required for an airline transport rating. You cannot fly in the right seat of an airliner now without an ATP, which requires 1,500 hours, and nobody in this room, even with these rich people, I guess, not me, but you can't afford that. So how do you get that time? You give flight instruction. Now I want to give you one example. When Air Exec was active, the Santa Barbara Flying Club was there. One of my students was Matt Barnett. Matt just retired from Hawaiian Airlines. His beautiful daughter Bailey was an instructor here on the field. When I needed a biennial flight review, I could have gone to Matt or I could have gone to his daughter, but his daughter can't give me a flight review. She doesn't have the training. She is building up time so that she can go to an airline where she is now. As soon as she had enough time to be hired, boom, she leaves the flight instruction business and goes and flies in an airliner. You are going to be eliminating or making a huge mistake by not allowing professional pilots to continue giving flight instructions. I have spent 40 summers in Alaska. I fly a widgeon, I fly a goose, I fly a beaver. Most of the airplanes are tail draggers. When I want a flight review, I have to go to Mike Fountain. And he's one of the independents that we're talking about here. That's not okay. We have to have people like that available. You have to have people like me. I don't charge. In fact, I'm 81 years old. I gave up my flight instructor's rating last year because I just don't feel I'm capable of recovering from the impending accidents that you encounter as a flight instructor. I want to be safe. I'm still alive and well at this age. So I think it's very important that we continue providing a path for people like me to give flight instruction. I fly for the Sheriff's Aero Squad. I give free flight instruction and training I can't any longer, but as a freelance flight instructor, I provided a huge service to the Aero Squad. They saved the county hundreds of thousands of dollars by providing their own aircraft. I'm through, okay? That's it?
Keep going.
Okay. Okay, well, that's basically my story. I think it's a huge mistake. I've learned a lot tonight, and I thank you for that. And one of the things that I see might be a possibility is to limit this restriction to primary training that new students like the gentleman back here has to have to get into the flying business. My own granddaughter, I taught to fly. I sent her to Above All Aviation to do her solo. Cost me an extra $500, but I didn't want the liability in my own little tail dragger airplane. I gave the business to somebody here in town, and I'm very glad that I did that. Thank you.
Elwood, it's nice to see you, and when I need to get current in the tail dragger again, I'm still going to come looking for you.
It'll be free.
Assuming we follow all the rules, of course. Levi Maya. And I accidentally, not in deference to how much respect I have for Elwood, I didn't hit the start button, so I think you got 4 minutes there. Go ahead.
Well, I'll try to keep it short. Thank you. Good evening, commissioners, and thank you for allowing everyone to speak this evening. My name's Levi Maya. I'm a resident of the city of Santa Barbara, a private instrument-rated pilot and an aircraft owner based at the Signature Ramp here at Santa Barbara Airport. My aviation activities here are mainly charitable, personal flights and charitable flights for Angel Flight West. I've received instruction from many excellent instructors in the 12 years that I've been flying light aircraft, and many of those instructors have been based here at Santa Barbara, both independent and at the based flight schools. I'm gravely concerned about the proposal being considered here this evening. I think option 3 effectively disenfranchises and eliminates an entire class of commercial operators at Santa Barbara Airport because of the airport's inability to enforce its present rules. So I had a whole speech written up here in advance, and I did learn a lot by hearing this presentation, but I think what I've boiled it down to is that this so-called balanced approach appears not to be the only solution to the problem that will satisfy the FAA's objections to the current situation. Option 2, if properly enforced, would level the playing field while continuing to allow healthy competition and airport revenue-generating flight instruction here on the field. It seems that there's a rush to adopt a more draconian approach to simplify this process rather than taking a more measured approach to crafting a fair and equitable solution for all parties involved. I urge the Commission to direct staff to look at solutions that will be acceptable to the FAA and also allow independent flight instruction to continue. I'm fairly certain that such a solution exists, should there be a will to find it. I appreciate that Mr. Thompson and his staff's diligence on this matter, and that it's not the only matter facing the airport administration. I just hope that this issue will receive the attention that it deserves, and a solution that preserves the privileges of independent instructors and assures SBA's continued compliance with grant assurances. So thank you.
Thanks. Mr. Fontaine. Michael.
Really know that there's much I'm going to say that hasn't already been said 100 times, but one of the points that comes to my mind is if there are such tremendous advantages in being an independent contractor, what is to prevent the brick and mortar operations from taking advantage of the MSRs as they currently exist and becoming independent contractors? So one of the things that we don't talk about is the number of things that an independent contractor gives up by choosing not to be a brick and mortar operation. One of the first things is if someone comes to me and says, I want to take flying lessons from you, I have to say, well, when you've got an airplane, give me a call back. So imagine going to a car dealership and saying, I'd like to purchase that car, but I'd love to take it for a drive first before I decide to buy it. And you have to say, well, once you've purchased the car, you can drive it as much as you want. So that's one of the things I give up. I can't have employees, so I can't make any money off anybody else. So all I have to sell is my time. I can't take, as a non-141 school, I can't take any instruction that is, or clients who are receiving government money. So if someone comes back from Afghanistan or something like that and has government money that is helping to pay for their flight instruction, I have to turn them away. And then there's just simply how does it look to someone who's taking on an activity which is going to be relatively expensive, and they need to form a bond of trust with the person that they're going to be taking lessons with, when that person just shows up in their truck and says, okay, let's go fly, right? What's to assure them that I'm not going to just disappear tomorrow? There's definite reputation and so on that comes from having a brick and mortar operation. So I think there are several things that haven't been discussed in this idea of fairness. By all means, stop being a brick and mortar operator and become an independent contractor. If there's such tremendous advantages in doing that, why would an industry not take advantage of the regulations that exist in order to maximize their profits? So that's something that's not been talked about. I have looked at, just in the last couple of days, because we haven't had a lot of time to look at this, I've looked at in the last couple of days at some minimum standards. Paso Robles Airport has exactly the wordage that Carl alluded to, as does John Wayne Airport, or very similar. I'm not going to say it's exact. So we have a little tiny airport out in the countryside, and we have a massive airport in the heart of Los Angeles. And they both allow independent contractors. So I don't know why Santa Barbara should take a policy which has been tried in the past and didn't work because it couldn't be enforced and because it wasn't fair, and just repeat history. It didn't work in the past. We have had this policy before. So that's pretty much it.
Thanks, Mike.
You bet.
James Watson.
I have my own stopwatch here. So
Yeah.
Hopefully I'll keep it quick. So thank you to the commissioners for serving, and thanks for to the airport people for working hard on this proposal. But that doesn't change the fact that this proposal, as I see it before the commission, is flawed, deeply flawed, and should be tabled until it's further evaluated and worked out. It's not worked out right now. But from the FAA Airport Compliance Manual 5190.6 Bravo, Appendix C, the owner or operator of any airport that has been developed or improved with federal grant assistance is required to operate the airport for the use and benefit of the public and to make it available for all types, kinds, and classes of aeronautical activity and without granting an exclusive right. By excluding an entire class of appropriately qualified providers, the independent contractors that are licensed by the FAA, this proposal is in violation of FAA grant assurances and with absolute certainty will trigger some form of complaints and lawsuits and put the grant assurances at risk. Passage of these changes, as proposed, will leave the airport worse off and cause us to end right back up here in 6 months to a year. The number two thing I want to talk about is in this presentation we said this is a safer proposal, and I do not believe that at all. Banning off, I'm going to talk about the maintenance side of it. Banning off airport-based providers, such as maintenance, exposes the airport to significant risk. With one maintenance provider sometimes denying maintenance services to GA owners for whatever reason, and another that does GA work as time permits, leaves general aviation owners in a quandary if the airport in a precarious situation. What happens when an airplane has a problem that leaves it marginally airworthy, is denied service for whatever reason on the airport because neither of our fixed-based maintenance providers can handle it, and the pilot makes a bad decision and tries to take it to an off-airport maintenance facility and crashes on the way there because of a problem that could have been prevented by an on-airport licensed maintenance provider. This is a very real risk. This is also in violation of 5190.6b, Section 8.9, Paragraph B. An exclusive rights violation is the denial by the airport sponsor to afford other qualified parties an opportunity to be an on-airport aeronautical service provider. As Mr. Thompson is fond of saying, it only takes one, and I think if you look at the room, there's a lot of us here. So, thank you.
Thanks, James. Denny Epperson. I'm sorry? Okay. And last but not least, Robert Rice.
Thank you all for hearing our thoughts. The proposal that's been placed before you would really hurt the flight instructors, and the director of the airport came to one of our Santa Barbara Flying Club meetings, and that was, to our best of our knowledge, the first community input to it. So, we don't know about all the background that supposedly took place. The complaint letter had been on file for a year, and we were still in the dark. No proactive effort has been made by this airport to reach out to us of the GA community about these changes. And in this meeting, there's a proposal that will wipe out a whole class of members here. You folks have my letter in front of you. It speaks to individual rights. I think that's a very important thing for you to consider. Thank you.
Thank you. So I want to thank everybody for being respectful and your presence, and also keeping it to 3 minutes. Do we have any other last-minute speaker slips? Or anybody who wants to create a last-minute speaker slip? Okay, so with that, I'd like to do a slip. Can I do a slip? You can, Vince, you can do a slip really quick.
I think there's lots of points here that really need to be thoroughly flushed out, and my hope is that the commissioners here will recognize that what we've received is not really a proposal of any substance for you folks to make any decision about. And I could stand up here for a couple hours and talk about some of the very important things. Obviously, I don't have time to do that. Just picking one out of the random, there's frequently a talk of a level playing field. And we've been repeatedly told that, well, it's got to be a level playing field. I ask you gentlemen, please, let's discuss what constitutes a level playing field. Is it one in which every business on the field succeeds? Certainly that's not the definition of a level playing field. A level playing field should establish some rules, and then everybody gets to play. And some fail, and some succeed. And that's a very important part of this. And if the government basically gives exclusive rights, a very serious violation of the FAA rules, it is basically using government power to exclude competition, and ends up costing these folks, as was brought out by is a big deal for the students, it's more expensive. And there's no reason for it. I could go on forever here. Now, should we select, as came out from the Commissioner Paul, well, gee, you could, if the issue is to have something you can regulate and you can police, is that the criteria? In many cases, having regulations which are less regulation results in a better result. So trying to put all this stuff on here about, gee, it's got to be something we got to regulate and we got to hire somebody else to enforce it, please, gentlemen, consider that. It's absolutely nuts. And if you want me to go on, I can go on all night. This thing is deeply flawed. Deeply.
Thanks, Vince. So you did get the last word. Thanks for keeping it under 3 minutes. All night was not going to be in the cards. So thanks again for everybody providing your input. And at this point, before I ask if there's a motion to make, I think I'm going to avail the services of the Assistant City Attorney. That is your title, is that correct?
It is, Chair Curie. I would, if the commissioners wish to comment, I think you were just on questions. I don't know if there was any comments.
Do we have any
I don't-
comments?
Yes.
Go ahead.
As is obvious, I agree that what we have here, I have problems with. But the biggest problem I have is that at least the written recommendation is to adopt the proposed policy change, prohibiting independent commercial service providers, including flight instructions on the airport. And yet, most of the questions that I asked and some of the other commissioners were, well, that's to be figured out in the details. Now, I don't know whether this quote is accurate or not, but it was widely said that back when Obamacare was passed, that Nancy Pelosi said, of this 1,300-page law, we have to pass it in order to find out what's in it. Well, maybe she did, maybe she didn't, but I feel like that's what I'm being asked to do, to approve a proposed policy that has so much difference in detail. As an example, you must go through a flight school, or maybe if you just lease 100 square feet. That's a huge difference to my way of thinking. So I don't want to discourage the airport from pursuing a plan. What I would like to encourage the airport, as is been made quite clear here, is go back, and although the 2017 was not a complete success, it did last for a good year before we had a complaint, that we met with numerous people in several meetings. When the MSR was done the last time, there was probably 20 people in a room for a couple of hours on at least 3 different occasions. We need the input from the people here, the instructors, the flight schools, the independent mechanics, et cetera, and possibly the airport commissioners to develop that policy. If you bring that policy back to us with the detail, then I think we'll have something that we can actually vote on. The second half of this was to update the Santa Barbara Airport minimum standards. I could support a statement saying, airport staff, please work with the community and update the standards. What I can't support is this specific direction that is too vague to be something that I could vote on.
Any other commissioners?
Yeah, I'd like to comment on this too, and I think we're hitting upon the real issue, is we're being asked to vote to adopt a policy that really doesn't exist yet. And I'm not saying that we can't make change happen at this airport, and I'm agreeing that we need to protect our airport improvement funds, absolutely. And we do need to have an environment where the airport is held harmless and people are insured. So we need to get some changes done. I don't have a policy here to vote on.
Commissioner Wilson or anybody else?
My only concern is our federal funding to keep this a viable airport. If we lose our grant money as a result of not making a decision, we are in deep trouble.
Okay, thank you. So Teva, I'm going to ask for your help here.
Chairman,
yes, sir.
Let me make one final comment on this. This is a very complex issue, and it is for that reason we didn't draft up the details of a policy and bring that to you today. The direction that staff is seeking today is, again, commitment to address this issue, which I think everyone's on board with, and clear intent in the direction in which we go into with this. And we've identified the direction as a first step, because had we come to you with numerous options, we would be in the same situation. So we've examined many options, and we're looking for direction on a path forward today. We never intended to bring to you today a flushed out policy, okay? That's always been intended to be phase one of this process. And that's a necessary approach because of the complexity of it. So there is no policy today to discuss. There are details that remain to be flushed out, and there's a process we will go through in order to get there. But we have to start somewhere with this, and you know, what we've laid out for you today is a path forward and the explanation why we selected the path forward that we've selected for your consideration.
Okay, thanks, Henry. I would still like to call on Tava for some help here. I'm searching for the words in my mind for a motion that I would propose that acknowledges the FAA is not going to sit idly by while we ponder this for another year or 6 months. My expectation and understanding is they're watching and listening, and they expect us to take action. And so we certainly need, and I don't think anybody on the commission would disagree with this, we certainly need to empower you to do that, for sure. Are they going to remove tomorrow? No. Is that a pretty drastic step? Yes. I think I recall saying 2 years ago, almost to the day, when we had 3 stakeholder meetings, that any solution the government creates usually makes everybody unhappy. I think elevating, getting off the FAA's radar screen is an extraordinarily good idea. And we need to do that quickly while we figure out the details. So at the same time, I think it's reasonable to acknowledge some commissioners' concern that the word adopt implies you've delivered to us the details, and it's we vote yes to adopt it, or we vote no not to adopt it. And I know that's not where we're at today. We are not ready to adopt the details because they haven't been created. But you've certainly given us the direction.
Correct. And what we're, in fact, looking for is that direction to move forward in. That's what your staff needs, is concurrence with the direction that we're proposing or recommending to this body.
So I think I'm going to take a stab at a motion. And that stab will be, rather than break this up into 2 pieces, I'm contemplating a motion that authorizes or directs, I suppose directs is probably the correct word, directs the airport staff to create a policy that protects the airport improvement funds or protects our relationship with the FAA. And we'll have to talk about that language here just for a minute. And updates the SBA minimum standards accordingly. So Tava, as you were taking notes there, can you read back kind of the crux of that and see if I can beat that into a motion?
Chair Curry, you've suggested a motion that directs the airport staff to create a policy that protects airport improvement program grant funding and updates the minimum standards accordingly.
Okay. I'm somewhat comfortable with that. So essentially, I don't think anybody on the committee or even in the community would disagree that if we look at the order of priority here, we need to be very concerned that a current informal complaint doesn't become a formal complaint, because then the wheels of the government, i.e. the FAA, are going to start turning. So read that back to me one more time, Tava.
A proposed motion that directs the airport staff to create a policy that protects airport improvement program grant funding and updates minimum standards accordingly.
I think I would just add that updates the SBA minimum standards to address independent commercial services. Period.
How about with user input?
So if you could read that back to me.
Proposed motion that directs airport staff to create a policy that protects airport improvement program grant funding and updates the Santa Barbara Airport minimum standards accordingly to address independent commercial activity.
Okay, I think I'm going to put a period on that.
Mr. Chairman, if I might propose an amendment, could we strengthen the wording of protecting the grant eligibility to include in conformance with FAA requirements?
Or guidance, perhaps.
That the policy that we develop is in conformance with the FAA requirements.
I think I'm going to, thank you, Commissioner Wilson. I think I'm going to stand on that motion as I stated it. So,
I will accept that.
Excuse me?
Yes, sir.
I would like an amendment to say that, could you read that one more time for me?
The proposed motion, because as I understand it, Chair
Yes.
Curry actually hasn't moved it yet.
Right.
So we're open for discussion, is to direct airport staff to create a policy that protects airport improvement program grant funding and updates Santa Barbara Airport minimum standards accordingly to address independent commercial activity.
I would request that you add with at least one, and preferably two, public meetings with widespread, with advance notice and widespread notice that includes all the stakeholders. I believe that this was a good start of communication, basically the first real communications we've had on the subject since 2017. And I think that if, excuse me.
Saved by the bell.
May not be loud to you, but it's blowing my ears out with my hearing aids. This was the first good communication we've had with the stakeholders since 2017. And although staff has heard a lot, I do not believe that the stakeholders here who have had basically 8 days to respond, as opposed to the airport's 9 months or more, we need more of this type of communication, because otherwise what we're going to get is basically what's proposed here, and I can't support that. But I do believe that by working together, there's a good chance, in a collaborative manner, there's a good chance we could come up with something better. So with the addition of those meetings, I could support that. Without it, I cannot.
Thanks, Commissioner.
Chairman.
So I think
or
that's
Curry.
probably a 3-minute or 4-minute motion, which I'm not likely to do. But we have we have one more airport commission meeting this year, which is in December. We have staff holidays, commissioner holidays, vacations. So it strikes me that it is a pretty tall order for you folks to beat out all the details. And I know you've heard everybody's comments. I know you've read them. I know you've met with people. I know you've met with commissioners, including myself. I believe you've committed to continue to do that. So I don't think I will change my motion, but what I would say on record is it would be my expectation that you would not bring, I don't believe you have sufficient time and resources to consider the input you've gotten today, the input you are likely to continue to get, in combination with the holidays. I don't think it's reasonable to ask or expect you to bring back to the commission in 30 days the details. So while I don't think I will change my motion, what I would go on record saying is it is my expectation that you would bring back to the commission the details of your proposed policy changes and minimum standards changes no earlier than the January 20th. That may not be the right date, but no earlier than the January commission meeting, so that you have the appropriate time to really digest and everybody has the appropriate time to add any additional comments. So I don't think I can make that, and I don't think I'm going to make that part of the motion. But Henry, is that a reasonable, and again, we don't have Mr. FAA or Ms. FAA here, but I'm 100% sure that, or I'm reasonably certain that they are looking to us to, we're not kicking a can down the road. So, do you feel comfortable with the, I wouldn't say delay, but the extra time I'm asking you to deliberate on this and to work on the details so that you can come back you and staff can come back in the January meeting, which is about 2 months from now, with something that's very well fleshed out?
Chairman O'Curry, yes, sir. What you've just described is in line with what we've presented to you tonight, and that is laying a path to move this issue forward, and that the next step would be to flesh out the details of a proposal to change the minimum standards. I have committed multiple times throughout this discussion tonight that we would have more public input and more discussion on this matter, and I'm committed to do that as well.
Okay, so I'm going to leave my motion as is. If you could read that back for us just one more time.
Chair Curry, the commissioners, the proposed motion is to direct the airport staff to create a policy that that protects airport improvement program grant funding and updates the Santa Barbara Airport minimum standards accordingly to address independent commercial activity.
I'm going to have to add, pen at the ready, and to present such recommendations to the Airport Commission no earlier than the January meeting. No earlier than the January meeting. In other words, don't come back to us in December and say I have the details worked out, because I don't think that's enough time.
Yeah.
I will second your motion.
All in favor?
Aye.
All opposed?
No, I cannot support it without a commitment for a motion commitment for meetings involving the entire stakeholders.
So motion carries with one nay. And with that, I'll adjourn the Airport Commission meeting.